Today, on the Liberal Religious Hour, we are very pleased to present Reverend Martha Munson, our pulpit guest, and her sermon, The Bible for Religious Liberals. Reverend Munson is the minister in the Unitarian Church in East Aurora, New York, and was our guest pulpit on March 26, 2000.
In keeping with a biblical theme for today, these are words from the Song of Solomon in the Hebrew Scriptures. Fitting, we hope. For now the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of singing has come. The fig tree puts forth its figs, and the vines are in blossom. They give forth fragrance. In this sacred place, listen to the sounds of breathing, creaking chairs, children below, clearing throats, and sighing all around. Know that each breath, movement, the glance meant for you or intercepted holds a life within it. These are signs we choose to be in this company, have things to say to each other. Things not yet said, but in each other's presence still trembling behind our heart's doors. These doors closed but unlocked. Each thing silent and waiting. On the threshold between unknowing and knowing. Between being hidden and being known. Find the silence among these people and listen to it all. Breathing, sighs, movement, holding back. Hear the tears that have not yet reached their eyes. Perhaps they are your own. Hear also the laughter building deep where joy abides, despite everything. Let us listen in the silence together. Listen and rejoice. Blessed be. Amen. Biblical family values. I get confused when people talk about biblical family values. I wonder what biblical family they're talking about. Is it Abraham's family, where his wife Sarah persuaded him to sleep with her maid so the maid could bear him a child, and then when Sarah had her own son, convinced Abraham to throw out the maid and the boy into the desert with no food or water? Or is it Jacob's family? He was tricked by his father-in-law into marrying his true love's sister instead of the woman he loved. Jacob then married the woman he loved in addition to her sister, and the two sisters had a baby birthing competition which resulted in the 12 tribes of Israel. 11 of those children then sold their brother Joseph into slavery instead of murdering him, which was their original plan. They took his torn coat of many colors home after having soaked it in animal blood and told their father that his favorite son had been torn apart by wild animals. Put that family into modern times and you'd be talking years of therapeutic intervention at the very least. The biblical family values crowd would be shaking their heads hearing about a family like that and talking about the breakdown of society and blaming the women's movement. When they say biblical family values, are they talking about King David's family? He fell in love with Bathsheba, who was married to someone else. David had her husband sent to the front lines in battle. When he was killed, David married Bathsheba. Is that the family that embodies the kind of values we're talking about? Or is it David and Bathsheba's son Solomon that they are pointing to? He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Maybe I'm sticking to the Hebrew Bible too much. Let's look at Jesus' family. His mother was expecting before she was married, and Joseph raised Jesus even though he wasn't his flesh and blood. These seem like pretty good values to me, but they aren't usually the ones preached by the biblical family values crowd. Jesus himself certainly didn't grow up to be a conservative pillar of the community with a family of his own, a minivan, and a job with regular hours. I don't think these people would approve of him much, and certainly they would never have let him run for office. Biblical families are real, like ours and the ones next door. There are stepchildren and feuds, adultery and intrigue, anguish and love, caring, intimacy, violence, and revenge. I can't see the biblical family values people wanting to know about actual biblical families. I can't see them wanting those families in their neighborhoods or in their churches. Do they think we don't read the Bible for ourselves? Maybe they haven't read it. Maybe they hope we let them feed the Bible to us in simple pieces, easy to chew up, easy to digest. I heard a songwriter from Lubbock, Texas, summarize on public radio one of these bite-sized Bible bits. He said, "We learn two things. God loves you, and he'll send you straight to hell. And sex is evil, dirty, and dangerous, and you should save it for the one you love." The biblical families they are talking about are not the ones I spent so much time studying in seminary. The radical right can push whatever political agenda it wants to, and they can try to legislate whatever kind of morality they want to. This is a democracy, and they are free to push, and we are free also to push our values in the public arena. When they talk about biblical family values, be sure to ask them which biblical family lived out the upright, sugary visions dancing in their heads. I'd be interested to know the answer. I think Meg Barnhouse is exactly right. I think she's right about a lot of things, in fact, and I've very much enjoyed reading her little book with many vignettes like this. I imagine that she, like the book, is gutsy and provocative. She's exactly correct about the biblical family values crowd. But this service is not an attack on the religious right. It's not even about biblical fundamentalism, but rather what the Bible might mean to us as modern-day religious liberals. The Bible, the Hebrew and the Greek scriptures, contain books of stories by and about people. And I submit that these are our stories. The stories that ground and inform our culture, our literature, and our poetry. Now, sometimes it seems like we are moved more by the stories of other cultures and traditions. Perhaps it's that we've heard these biblical accounts so many times that they've lost their power and their meaning, and we've stopped really listening. Or perhaps there's a certain smugness in the way that we say, well, we've grown beyond all of that superstitious nonsense. But we know these stories, and in some way they belong to us. More, these stories have timeless themes. You remember. There's the story of David and Goliath, where the weak triumphs over the mighty. And there's the eternal question about why the good suffer, posed in Job. And then there's the story of the Good Samaritan, whose help we all need from time to time, and who at our best moments we would aspire to be. And there's Ruth's extraordinary faithfulness. Who of us hasn't sometime desperately needed or wanted a friend like Ruth? There's the lesson of the woman caught in adultery, who is saved from stoning by Jesus. Other stories from other traditions may seem newer and fresher, but these stories, considered well, retain their power, and they're our stories. Robert Fulgham, another Unitarian Universalist minister, makes a point in what he calls the Storytellers Creed. Any storytellers present? There you go. I believe that imagination is stronger than knowledge, that myth is more potent than history, that dreams are more powerful than facts, that hope always triumphs over experience, that laughter is the only cure for grief, and I believe that love is stronger than death. Far be it from me, a rationalist if ever there was one, to say to a crowd of Unitarian Universalists that history and facts are unimportant. It's not true, and I wouldn't say it. But I know that our hearts and our souls are moved and stirred by imagination, myth, and dreams. The stories in the Bible work because, as Meg Barnhouse says, biblical families are real, like ours and the ones next door. There are stepchildren and feuds, adultery and intrigue, anguish, love, caring, intimacy, violence, and revenge. Do you remember the strange story of Jacob? Jacob was by himself one night by a river, and a strange figure appeared and touched him. Was it a man? Was it an angel? Was it God himself? Jacob and this figure wrestled through the night. It was an equal fight, and neither one prevailed. And although Jacob bore the scar or mark of the fight forever, as dawn was breaking, the strange figure called upon Jacob to let him go. But Jacob would not, demanding first a blessing. And in the end, the figure did bless Jacob. And Jacob found that, having seen God face to face, he was no longer afraid of anything. I spent a lot of my early years being afraid, feeling as if I was somehow unworthy, feeling not blessed but cursed by life. My wrestling with God or purpose or meaning, I don't know that I have an adequate name for it, the cosmos, that wrestling left a mark on me. But as Jacob was blessed and finally knew it, so I too finally came to know that I was blessed by life. Jacob's story might serve as a metaphor for the kind of relationships that religious liberals can have with the Bible. There's no way to deal with it reasonably or rationally without wrestling. We know it's not the literal, handed down from God, word for word truth. And while we get distressed at other people for proof texting their particular pieces, there's no way not to do that with the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, and so we too must do that. We need to choose, pick, figure out what feels right to us from that whole long line of tradition which undergirds our culture. While I am no biblical scholar, I had the required courses in theological school. One time as a child, I could even recite all of the books of the Hebrew scriptures from memory. Yesterday I tried to do it again, and I realized that now I can only do half. And while I am no scholar, I love to hold my own with the biblical fundamentalist who would try to convince me that their God is hard and mean and small and narrow. They quote one exclusive passage, and I quote John. In my Father's house are many mansions, not just one. I have other sheep, not of this fold. There are other signs, not recorded in this book. And one of the most inclusive passages of all. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in the sight of God. Unless we get bogged down here with the religious right, which I really don't want to do, these sorts of words and phrases support my universalism, that nothing can separate us from all that is holy, from the source of our being, from the powers that uphold our lives and cradle us from birth to death, perhaps before, and maybe beyond. Or in words from Romans, for I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation can separate us from the love of God. For me, whatever God is bigger and wider and more expansive than any of us can ever imagine. And whatever God is, none of us can ever be separated from the source of life itself. The question for Unitarian Universalists is not so much, however, about faith as it is about works, or in language most familiar to us, it's not about creeds, it's about deeds. The book of James proclaims, if a brother or a sister is ill-clad and in lack of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and filled, what does it profit? So faith, if by itself, if it has no works, is dead. And Matthew records that Jesus told his disciples, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you came to me. And challenged, Jesus told his followers, truly I say to you, as you did this to the least of these, you have done it to me. Clearly, the biblical theme in this context is about rolling up our sleeves and getting about the work of the world, being among those who need our help most. There are timeless biblical themes. At least one of them is the question, am I my brother's keeper? The obvious answer for Cain and for us is, of course I'm my brother's keeper. But what does that mean? What is required of us vis-a-vis our families and our friends? More wrestling. The oft-repeated rule, which no doubt you can quote, is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But we all know that that's easier said than done, and sometimes it's hard to discern. There are the timeless themes of the human condition, the dissonance between what we aspire to be and what we actually do. Simon falls asleep while Jesus prays at Gethsemane, and Jesus says to him, "The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." Or in the same vein, Paul writes to the Romans saying, "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very things I hate. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it." We, you and I, we have good intentions, but we grow tired, and we fall short, and sometimes we fall asleep. And there are timeless themes that stir our hearts as they stirred the hearts of people long ago. The prophet Isaiah envisioned a time in which they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. A dream from sometime between the 6th and the 8th and the 6th century before the Common Era, but it's our dream too. And there are the timeless themes which we know in our hearts to be true. For everything there is a season, a time for every matter unto heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time for love and a time for hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Long before our era, Ecclesiastes, also called the preacher, knew that there was indeed a time for everything, a season. He also knew that all is vanity, that everything in this world is transient. And later Timothy would say that the love of money is the root of all evil. And Jesus would say, life does not consist of an abundance of possessions. Timeless themes indeed. The Greek scriptures contain valuable information for us about how religious communities should get along. The responsive reading that we shared earlier, that 13 Corinthians 1, in the 20th century, every clergy person I know has read it more often than they care to read it at a wedding. That's not what it was written for, however. Paul wrote it to the people at Corinth to tell them how they should get along in religious community. It's not about romance. It was a prescription for the people at Corinth about how to be religious people relating to each other. I encourage you to go back and read it again in that context so that you might consider how and if you think it applies to this congregation. Paul tells the Corinthians and the Romans about valuing their differing gifts. Heavens knows we need to do that in our churches. And he tells the Ephesians to speak the truth to one another in love. And he tells the people at Thessalonica that they should be at peace among themselves. These sorts of rules have preserved religious traditions through all these years, and they just might have something to say to us as well. And I commend to you also the idea of choosing a phrase or two or a story with which you might wrestle. For some time now, I've been trying to walk with the prophet Micah, who asked, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your God?" and I wrestle. How do I do justice when injustice abounds? Much is wrong with the world. Must I try to right everything? How do I choose? How can I do justice in the world when I have so much and other people have so little? And I wrestle. Love, kindness? Kindness seems to evoke a kind of gentleness that is not usual for me. And so it's hard. And what about the kind of kindness that is just too much? It's kind of smothering and killing. And I wrestle. Walk humbly with your God. Who or what is God? And I'm certainly humbled to be alive and grateful every single day. But what does it mean? What would it really mean if I were to be walking humbly with my God? And so I invite you simply to reflect on these old stories in a fresh way for yourself. What are your favorites and why? And what did they mean to you? What might they mean to you? How do they speak to your life and your experience? The Bible is not a history book in any modern sense. It's a book about the human condition, your condition and my condition. May our hearts be stirred once again by the power of imagination and myth and dreams embodied in those stories, which are indeed our stories.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.